Hello, everyone. This is Junaid, and welcome to another must watch episode on the Fly podcast. Here we have with us a special guest. He takes to GMAT what method actors take to acting. He takes the GMAT exams himself to stay abreast of the developments and imparts those learnings into his GMAT coaches. Mentoring more than 8,000 students for GMAT, he is the founder of GMAT 30. I introduce you Mr. Paramjit Das. Hello, Param. It's a pleasure to have you here and welcome to the Fly Podcasts.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Junaid. Lovely to be here.
So, we got a lot to discuss about. Therefore, here's what we're going to do. We will do this as a two-part podcast. So, you GMAT candidates out there, this one's all for you. Stay tuned. Let's get started right away. So, let's start with the first question that comes to our viewers' minds at the start of this journey. Choosing GMAT versus GRE for the B school process applications. So, your take on that, Param.
Right. So, although most business schools nowadays say that it simply doesn't matter whether you write the GMAT or whether you write the GRE, in fact, most business schools accept either the GMAT or the GRE as part of their admission process. However, it is worth noting that the B schools accepting GRE for their, or as part of their admissions process is a very recent phenomenon. I mean, before 2017, the GMAT was the go-to exam as far as MBA applications were concerned, and the GRE was considered the standard exam for mainly master's programs, PhD programs, and the like, right? So now, with the GRE and GMAT competing with each other since 2017, the GRE has definitely gained some ground on the GMAT, in as far as the GRE being a standard exam for MBA applications is concerned. However, considering the amount of data that a B school would have to compare the different candidates or to rank the different candidates according to percentiles, the data for GMAT is going to be invariably a huge amount larger than that for the GRE, right? So,
Yeah.
although business schools say that either the GMAT or the GRE is okay as an exam, you have to take that with a grain of salt because ultimately, if a B school has a better benchmarking standard for a particular exam, then that exam automatically gets a little bit of preference as compared to the GRE, right?
Yeah.
Another thing also is that with the recent phenomenon of the GRE online exam or the GRE at home exam, and with the huge myriad of cheating allegations that have been ongoing for the past 3 or 4 years, and the ETSs seem as extremely lenient on that. So again, B schools always sort of look at the GRE with a bit of, a frown, whereas the GMAT is still considered the benchmark. Every GMAT online exam, especially if there is any suspicion of cheating whatsoever, goes into an admin review. The GMAT in-center exams any which way are impossible to cheat at. But with the GRE online exams, you see a lot of reports, especially in times of India as well, that there are these, cheating allegations that are pretty rife out there. So business schools are always more likely to look at such scores with a bit more of a higher benchmarking marking parameter as well. For example, if a GMAT score of 720 is sort of the median or the cutoff for a business school, and I use the word cutoff in a metaphorical sense because, of course, business schools don't release cutoffs, but let's say it's the score for your profile, then a corresponding GRE score could very well look something in the range of 332 and beyond, right? Which is a much tougher ask to accomplish on the GRE. So, traditions work simply because, they have been around for a long time. So, anybody who is trying to prepare or appear or get into a business school, the GMAT should always be their go-to exam. For a master's program, for example, a STEM program, or even for a PhD program, then the GRE should be the standard exam.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's say if we take GMAT in itself, we now have the regular GMAT versus the GMAT Focus Edition. Now we know that from Jan 31st, the current version of GMAT is going to be discontinued. So let's focus on the GMAT Focus Edition. So, what is this
Absolutely.
GMAT Focus Edition?
Absolutely. So I think, in all honesty, it's mainly to do with giving the GMAT a more sleek look to make it more marketable, especially to the Indian audience, right? Because what you had on the classic GMAT was mainly the verbal section was quite an Achilles heel for a lot of our students, right? In verbal, you had critical reasoning, reading comprehension, and sentence correction. And mainly, sentence correction was the part that a lot of our students found challenging, right? In fact, 70% of the students who come to us, they say that, the other sections of verbal are pretty sorted, and it's the sentence correction that's giving them a pain. And then the GMAT started to lose ground to the GRE, at least amongst others, for that very reason, that the GRE did not have any grammar or sentence correction, right? And grammar is not really a thing that you can master in a very short amount of time, whereas critical reasoning, comprehension skills, or vocab skills, which is what the GRE tests you on, those are skills that you can master reasonably quicker, right? Or at least that is the perception. Objectively, it might take maybe 3 or 4 months extra here and there, but the perception matters, right? So once the GMAT started to lose ground to the GRE, especially during the COVID time period, right? That's when GRE saw a huge surge in the number of test takers. The GMAT started to design ways to make the exam more palatable, if you may, to the Indian audience, right? Because Indians constitute a huge proportion of the test takers writing the GMAT. Now, the GRE obviously mirrored those changes, and now we have got both exams, which are about an hour shorter from their original. So that's one difference, that the GMAT Focus Edition is roughly an hour shorter than the classic GMAT. It does not contain any sentence correction, so that's good news, but only on the surface, and we shall explain why it's only on the surface. But just from a purely, administrative vantage point, it's 1 hour shorter. There is no sentence correction, there is no AWA, essay writing, and as far as math is concerned, there is no geometry. And then they have got a new section which is called Data Insights, which is nothing but the former integrated reasoning section in classic GMAT, plus the data sufficiency question types from Quant. So they have combined those sections into one section called DI, and that also becomes part of the scaled score. And as you would know, and as most of the audience here would know, most of your viewers would know, the scaling pattern is also slightly different. The old GMAT used to be scored between 200 and 800, with only the quant and verbal sections contributing to the score. The Focus Edition GMAT will have all three sections combining equally to the score, with some minor variations here and there, and the grading is between 205 and 805, which with every individual section graded between 60 and 90. Plus, there are some, sleek features, but again, they appear sleek only on the surface. So now you have got a review feature in which you can change up to 3 answers per section, but the review feature only becomes available at the end of a section, right? Plus, we also conducted a webinar with Seema Parakat, who is the outreach manager at GMSE. And she said, and we validated this as much as well through our students who have written the exam, because now you get an ESR sort of thing as well at the end of the exam, right? So people who did use the review feature and changed their answers from incorrect to correct, actually their scores were very much in par with what it would have been, or what they would have been, had those questions been answered incorrectly to begin with, right? And that also makes sense, because ultimately the GMAT is still a question adaptive exam. So it seems a bit, naive to think that, you're able to change answers to a question on which the subsequent questions have been based without getting any significant penalty to the changes that you make, right? So for all intents and purposes, a test taker, or if you're someone who's preparing for the GMAT Focus Edition, treat the review feature as though it didn't exist, right? because there won't be any difference in your scores whatsoever, at least no market difference. Plus, you only get to experience it at the end of the section any which way. So those are the major changes.
We'll drill deep into this GMAT Focus Edition in our part two. But see, from a university's perspective, right? So, how do you think the universities are viewing this new GMAT Focus Edition scores? So, given that there are these differences, a marked difference between the classic GMAT scores and the GMAT Focus Edition scores.
True. So that's a very good question, Janet. So again, we did raise this up, or we just did bring this up with Seema, and she also mentioned that it's that they have educated the universities, made them aware of the changes. So between the time they decided to announce the launch of GMAT Focus, which was sometime in March or April of last year, and the state, which is 18th of January now, they have, they have driven a very successful awareness campaign, generated or informed universities about the changes and how the scores ought to be interpreted. The simple answer is that universities would always look at the percentiles, right? Because now there isn't really a direct X to X sort of comparison because the sections are different. IR earlier did not contribute to the score out of 800, now it does. So you can't really look at the sectional scores or even the scaled composite because the gradings are also significantly different. For example, earlier a score of 710 would be the 90th percentile on the GMAT. Now a score of 645 is the 90th percentile on the GMAT, right? And if you get above 705 on the GMAT Focus nowadays, it's equivalent to the 99th percentile, and anything above 725 is equivalent to the 100th percentile, right? So now there is also a 100th percentile on the GMAT, plus the individual sections percentiles are also hugely different. For example, Quant nowadays has a 93rd, 97th, 98th, 99th percentile, so on and so forth. So the bottom line is that universities would always look at the composite aggregate percentile instead of getting into the raw scaled scores or the raw composite scores, because then it would always be an apples to oranges sort of comparison. So that's how the universities are sort of going to treat the GMAT Focus Edition scores. Earlier, they would assign a certain amount of marks to a certain percentile score on GMAT Classic, and it would be the same marks that would be assigned to a corresponding percentile on the GMAT Focus Edition. So that would be the answer.
That was very insightful. Yeah. So with that, we come to the end of this part one of this podcast. But don't you go anywhere because Param and I have got a lot to talk about. We'll get back to part two. So stay tuned.